I shall preface this video by saying I am actually a Skulduggery Pleasant fan. Number 1. The absence of a focal challenge to be surmounted. If I were to ask you what had to be defeated in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, or the Harry Potter series, for things to be good again, what would your answers be? They would likely be obvious. In the Lord of the Rings, Sauron has to be defeated for Middle-earth to be truly safe. In Harry Potter, Voldemort has to be defeated for both the Wizarding World and the Muggle world to be safe. What has to be defeated for the world of Skulduggery Pleasant to be safe? Well, this is where it gets complicated. There isn't just one challenge or one villain to deal with. The Skulduggery Pleasant series has 3 different trilogies, and each one focuses on a different threat. Kind of. The first trilogy is often referred to as the Faceless Ones trilogy by the fanbase. Aside from the first book, Skulduggery Pleasant, which sets up the world and introduces the characters, each book is about Skulduggery and Valkyrie stopping plots and villains from bringing the Faceless Ones back to Earth. Here there is a clear enemy, and a focal challenge that has to be faced. Characters grow and improve their skills to stop the return of the Faceless Ones. This character growth has its payoff, when in the Faceless Ones, 3 Faceless Ones actually come through a portal and onto Earth, and our heroes have to stop them. The worst case scenario has come about, and if they fail now, the world will burn. Then the second trilogy, called the Deathbringer trilogy, is about stopping the Deathbringer. Kind of. The problem is that there is no focal challenge in the Deathbringer trilogy. Oh yes, Deathbringer is mentioned. There are cryptic exchanges between necromancers about the Deathbringer, but neither Valkyrie or Skulduggery are improving their skills or working towards stopping him or her. They are instead focused on dealing with terrorists in Dark Days, remnants in Mortal Coil, and then, in Deathbringer, they actually start paying attention to the threat of the Deathbringer. It's a weird transition. We go from one trilogy, where there is a central obstacle to overcome, to a trilogy where in every book there is a different and unconnected threat. Skulduggery and Valkyrie are not focused on anything other than solving several separate problems in each book of the trilogy. Skulduggery and Valkyrie's successes and victories in Dark Days do not really affect the plot of Mortal Coil, and the consequences of the actions in Mortal Coil do not affect the events of Deathbringer. You could remove Dark Days and Mortal Coil from the Deathbringer trilogy, and the principal events in Deathbringer wouldn't have changed. Craven would have still carved magical symbols and glyphs into Melancholia to increase her power levels, and she still would have tried to kill everyone on the planet. Nothing Skulduggery or Valkyrie did in the prior 2 books either hindered the plans of Craven and the Necromancers or affected them. In the previous trilogy, the effects in each book had meaning and consequences. In Playing with Fire, the grotesquerie was being used to bring back the Faceless Ones. When it was killed along with Baron Vengius, an attempt at bringing the Faceless Ones back to Earth was thwarted. Time was bought before Skulduggery and Valkyrie had to deal with one last final attempt to bring the Faceless Ones back to Earth. If they had failed in Playing with Fire, then the events in the rest of the books wouldn't have taken place. However, if Skulduggery and Valkyrie had failed in Dark Days, what would have happened? Nothing really. A load of innocent people would have died. And Craven would still have continued trying to convince the other necromancers that Melancholia was the Deathbringer. If Skulduggery and Valkyrie had failed in Mortal Coil, it certainly would have complicated things with Darkess running around the place with thousands of remnants, but I'm not sure if it would have drastically affected the plot of Deathbringer. The necromancers would still be trying to find him or her so they could stop Darkess and make themselves immortal so she couldn't kill them. Then the third trilogy. The Darkess trilogy focuses on dealing with the threat of Darkess. Kind of. Darkess doesn't become a real problem until towards the end of Last Stand of Dead Men. In Kingdom of the Wicked, our hero and heroine are dealing with a stupid idealist called Armageddon, rather than the threat of Darkess. Darkess appears in this novel, but similar to when she appears in Deathbringer, she isn't the real threat. It's treated as if she has just gone into Super Saiyan mode to deal with enemies she can't deal with in her normal form. In Last Stand of Dead Men, everyone is too busy warring to think about the threat of Darkess, and only in The Dying of the Light does everyone focus their efforts on trying to kill her. Nothing Skulduggery or Valkyrie do in Kingdom of the Wicked or in Last Stand of Dead Men is focused on dealing with the problem of Darkess. She is reduced to nothing but a subplot. So we have one trilogy, which is about stopping the Faceless Ones, a second trilogy about stopping terrorists, remnants, and the Deathbringer, and a third trilogy, concerned with stopping a super powerful idealist, fighting a war, and then stopping the great villain we have been told about since Book 4 who wants to end the world. I think the existence of 3 different trilogies which have no connection to each other is a mistake. I can't speak for everyone, but I felt the series lost all sense of direction after the Faceless Ones, even though I thoroughly enjoyed Deathbringer. Everything felt like filler, if I'm honest. Dark Days was just set up for Deathbringer, and Mortal Coil was just that book sandwiched in between, so that the climax of dealing with the Deathbringer didn't feel rushed. Kingdom of the Wicked was a nice, self-contained story, but other than introducing some new devices and characters, it didn't actually need to exist. Last Stand of Dead Men was just set up for the payoff that was Dying of the Light. If the entire book series had been focused on dealing with 1 or 2 problems or antagonists, I think the series would have had a much better sense of direction and a better flow. We would understand why the growth of the 2 main characters is important, and would understand where their stories would end if they were always thwarting the plans of Villain X. So how did we end up with such disconnected trilogies? I think the reason for this is partly down to the contract Derek Landy originally signed. HarperCollins wanted a trilogy, and so Derek Landy wrote the Faceless Ones trilogy. After the success of the Faceless Ones trilogy, HarperCollins asked him to write 6 more, and he agreed. So the biggest threat in the Skulduggery universe, the Faceless Ones, had already been dealt with, so Landy couldn't just write about more plots revolving around them, but instead had to quickly think up new threats for each trilogy, and it seems that in his rush to do so, he didn't make the events of each new book really connect to each other in a way that would have been preferable. Can't blame Landy too much though. Writing 6 books is a tall order. Number 2. Power creep. Apart from the previous problem I mentioned, I think this is the most obvious one. Valkyrie has a Super Saiyan version of herself called Darkess, and Skulduggery has his in the form of Lord Vile. In the first trilogy, these 2 forms are not known or shown. However, both make frequent appearances in the next 2 trilogies. The existence of such power in our hero and heroine has a natural consequence. It means that the villains have to be more than just powerful, they have to be super powerful to be a threat. These high power levels of the villains and the heroes in the later trilogies bring 2 problems. 1. It is difficult to comprehend and quantify the power and threat level of each hero and villain. If you have a story, and your protagonist is a teenage boy, let's call him Jake, and your villain is a fully grown man, let's call him Bob, then you already inherently understand the power each of these characters possess. If Jake is to engage Bob in combat and win, he'll have to have some advanced weapon or clever plan to defeat him, because the strength difference between a boy and a man is more than significant. However, there is a substantial difficulty in comprehending the power limits of magic. Magic itself is never explained very well in the Skulduggery series, but in the earlier books the abilities of each villain was given clear limits. Tesseract may have been able to break bones with exceptional ease, but he could only do so by tapping someone's bones rather than punching them. A rather nuanced limitation, but it does a lot to show that although he is powerful, he is defeatable. Also, this was the only magical ability he had. Contrast Tesseract with Darkess and Argaden in Kingdom of the Wicked, and you see immediate differences. Darkess gets her head chopped off by Malevolent, and reattaches it in the space of a few seconds. Then she kills several superpowered mortals with ease, and then Argaden raises them back from the dead. They do not have any limits to their power, and this makes it difficult to understand how they can lose any fights. How is it even possible for something to imprison Argaden? How would you ever stop these 2? By the end of Dying of the Light, Darkess can survive the concentrated fire of a minigun mounted on an Apache attack helicopter. These 2 are simply unkillable, and contrived plot devices have to be used to deal with them. In Kingdom of the Wicked, Darkess reattaches her severed head, and burns the mind of sensitives who try to incapacitate her. But she's brought back to her normal self by a bunch of flashing lights which give her a seizure. And it's just like, really? Flashing lights? I am honestly not convinced that an all-powerful being could be brought to their knees by bright lights. It sounds contrived and makes me think that Landy wrote himself into a corner. 2. A lack of tension. In the first trilogy and in the first book of the second trilogy, there was a genuine sense of tension. Lord Vile and Darkess had not been introduced, so what we saw was what we got. Neither Skulduggery or Valkyrie had a final boss mode, so when they face villains such as Serpine, who in contrast to the later villains is a total weakling, they posed a real threat, because if Skulduggery and Valkyrie were beaten, they were beaten. End of story. To continue with Serpine as an example, he almost killed Valkyrie with his red hand, and had to be killed by Skulduggery with the Sceptre of the Ancients, and this was only after they had almost lost against him in a fight. If then Valkyrie had known about her true name, this scene would have had no tension. Serpine's red hand would have done nothing to her, and she would have stopped his heart from beating. Once Valkyrie and Skulduggery start transforming into their darker forms to win battles, you know they can't realistically be beaten, unless they are facing someone like Argaden. Interestingly, however, this lack of tension works both ways. I found reading Dying of the Light that I could never get invested in anything Skulduggery or Valkyrie's reflection did, because the question was not, how can they beat Dark S, but instead, no, seriously, how can they beat Dark S? She can heal wounds in milliseconds. Are you going to use another Deus Ex Machina device, or some contrived plan to defeat her? The answer to that last question was yes, every single time, barring one. I never felt that anyone was in any danger, as I knew they had to have some super device, or very clever scheme, because if they didn't, then they would die before I turned over the next page. Now, there is a third but albeit smaller problem with the power creep, and that is the reveal that Skulduggery is Lord Vile, and has been for the entire series. So Skulduggery hates Serpine a lot, right? And he is captured in the first book by Serpine, who proceeds to torture him a lot. So why didn't Skulduggery turn into Lord Vile? I can't see a reason why he wouldn't, either intentionally or unintentionally. He is being put through agony by someone who he hates intensely for murdering his family. There is no reason why he wouldn't turn into Lord Vile, if only for a minute, to rip Serpine to shreds. Why didn't he turn into Lord Vile when facing the Faceless Ones in The Faceless Ones? If there was ever a time to enter your final form, surely it would be when the fate of the world hung in the balance. Are we to believe that Skulduggery would prefer the world to end, rather than reveal who he was during a large portion of the war? These questions wouldn't have to be answered if Skulduggery wasn't Lord Vile, but the reveal that he is makes these very pertinent questions. But the series doesn't address these queries or give any real solid answers. Number 3. Skulduggery Pleasant. I better be careful how I explain this point. I love Skulduggery as much as the next fan. Who doesn't like a suave, charming, and debonair undead skeleton? However, I must confess to having some criticisms of the character. 1. Skulduggery doesn't grow. Valkyrie Kane changes as a character throughout the series. Not just in terms of age, but also in terms of morality. The Valkyrie Kane in Dark Days, and before, would never have brutally attacked someone who attempted to mug her mother, but the Valkyrie Kane of Deathbringer would and did. Valkyrie grows as a character and is a very different person by the end of the book series. Skulduggery remains the same. Yes, his character is developed in Deathbringer, when more of his backstory is revealed and we discover that he was Lord Vile, and is the most powerful necromancer that has ever lived. You know what I mean! But besides learning how to fly and move through brick walls, does he change as a character? Not really. I can't point to any noticeable changes, so Skulduggery is a rather static character, and the conflicts he faces don't change him in the way they do Valkyrie, and his lack of growth is made more prominent when contrasted with Valkyrie's growth. 2. Skulduggery is almost too perfect. Now, we're told throughout the books that Skulduggery is burning with anger and hatred, but I cannot remember a time where Skulduggery did anything remotely morally questionable, or gave in to his rage. And no, I'm not counting acts he did as Lord Vile, because Lord Vile isn't Skulduggery, in the same way Dark S isn't Valkyrie. Lord Vile and Dark S are the evil in Skulduggery and Valkyrie incarnated. In Dying of the Light, when a guilt-ridden Valkyrie says that she has killed loads of people, every major character, other than her reflection, tells her that she didn't do it, but Dark S did. The point is made that Dark S is the person who exists when Valkyrie's virtues and values are stripped away. It is similar with Lord Vile and Skulduggery. Lord Vile is what exists when Skulduggery's virtues are taken away. Now, for an angry person burning up with hatred, Skulduggery seems remarkably controlled and doesn't compromise or do anything evil or anything particularly morally dubious. Valkyrie, however, does. As already mentioned, she brutally assaulted a criminal who had attempted to mug her mother, and almost killed him. Why? Because she loves her family, and her emotions were able to overcome her better judgment at that time. She also cheats on her boyfriend, with an obsessive vampire of all things. Valkyrie may not be a bad person per se, but she is no angel, and has some very disagreeable character flaws. All these things demonstrate how much of a three-dimensional character Valkyrie is. Even when she isn't Darkess, she has the capability to do nasty things. Valkyrie is very human because she has her virtues and her weaknesses. Skulduggery doesn't do anything as evil as Valkyrie, and he is never portrayed as a particularly flawed character. We are told about his dark past, but that is it. But there were opportunities in the series to see Skulduggery in a less than charitable light. I actually thought that when Scorn revealed China was the one who kidnapped his wife and brought her to Serpine, Skulduggery would lose his cool and attempt to kill her in a blind fit of rage. I expected to see Skulduggery's darker side in this chapter, and see the anger that multiple characters said he possessed. I was greatly anticipating this as I read that chapter, and I expected that the thing which would stop him killing China would be Valkyrie, or just a clever escape attempt from China because she is good at those things. But Skulduggery just walks away. It's very boring and anticlimactic, and I don't think it makes sense. Imagine if you had just discovered that someone who you considered a friend for centuries was exposed as having kidnapped your wife so someone could kill them. Wouldn't you be at least half mad? Wouldn't you try beating them senseless at the least? My theory on why Skulduggery walked away is that Landy didn't want his most beloved character to be shown in a compromised light. My suspicion is that he might have fallen into the trap of not wanting his favourite character to do anything wrong. This wouldn't be such a big problem, but when you have a series spanning 9 books, seeing the titular character in a good light all the time not only grows tiring, but it seems increasingly unrealistic. People are fallible beings, so everyone is going to make mistakes or be put in positions where they have to do very unsavoury things, especially when your job role is world saviour. 3. Skulduggery doesn't go through hell. This point relates back to my theory that Landy likes Skulduggery so much that he doesn't want him to suffer or be portrayed in less than a positive light. It also links back to my first point about Skulduggery not growing as a character. Now, in my opinion, the beginning of Dark Days is one of the best beginnings of the series, because we see Skulduggery in a powerless situation. While he is in the Faceless Ones dimension, he is helpless. He learns to fly while he is there, but he just isn't powerful enough to defeat any of the Faceless Ones. We can safely assume that he turned into Lord Vile multiple times to try and save himself, but of course that wasn't enough either. When Valkyrie finds him, he is just a pile of bones. To see a vulnerable Skulduggery who is suffering from hallucinations and knows he is in a fight he cannot win is very interesting, and this is something we don't see again in the series. The fact that he recovers so quickly when he comes back to Earth is disappointing though. He really should have actually been unhinged, rather than pretending to be. And this I think is a problem. I've already said Skulduggery doesn't go through hell, but you might be wondering how on earth I can make such a statement considering his time in the realm of the Faceless Ones and his grim past. I shall explain. The Skulduggery Pleasant series is an action one. Thus we see people suffer physically an awful lot. Bones are broken, teeth are lost, and stab wounds are plenty. In an action series, we come to expect that people will get bloodied up, so when a chapter starts detailing a torture scene, it isn't surprising. We expect our characters to go through lots of pain. However, something that is harder to write, and not always expected in an action novel, is the torture of one's psyche and spirit. Now this happens to Valkyrie, where in a last-ditch attempt to kill Darkess, she kills her baby sister so she can use the Scepter of Ancients. Nothing is physically stopping or challenging her. Killing a baby is as easy as stealing sweeties from one. However, the emotional turmoil of killing her sibling was intense, and it was a great section to read as Valkyrie struggled to do it and felt intense guilt even after the sunburst successfully brought Alice back to life. But it was not just written to be interesting to read. This section was in the book to grow and change Valkyrie as a character. Killing Alice fills her with so much guilt that she leaves Ireland to live in America in self-imposed exile. The small metaphoric hell she went through not only tortured her, it changed her. In contrast, Skulduggery has no such crucible to go through, which tortures him and changes his character. Even though he does go slightly mad in the dimension of the Faceless Ones, within a day of returning to Earth, he is back to normal practically. No emotional trauma. Nothing. He doesn't have to work through anything to emerge at the end of the tunnel as a transformed man. In fact, he doesn't do anything at all. Valkyrie is the one who saves him. In Dying of the Light, Skulduggery has to undergo 3 trials in the Necropolis. Now, as it was the final book, emphasis on was, I expected things to go down. If there ever was a time for Skulduggery to be challenged on a psychological level and have to go through immense challenges to activate the symbol on Valkyrie's shoulder, it was now. But honestly, it was disappointing. There was a good part where he met Ghastly, his wife and child again, but this was a very short chapter, and it turned from a test of will and emotions to a physical challenge as soon as the ghost started dragging him into the ground. My main problem is that the chapter felt too brief, and rushed over the test of emotion and will that Skulduggery was undergoing. There were some good moments, do not get me wrong, but it felt like Landy was uncomfortable writing it and turned to what he does best: action. It's a real shame because it would have been a great moment to see Skulduggery really struggle and almost fail to succeed, but he passes through each trial with relative ease, except of course for the last one, which he skips entirely. But what about his past? Yes, it genuinely sounds like he went through hell there and had some great character growth. The problem is that we never see it. We are told and not shown it, which isn't a problem per se, because it's a backstory. You're not normally supposed to show backstories. You're supposed to imply and tell them, unless you want to use flashbacks, obviously. So we don't get to see Skulduggery go through a metaphoric hell or suffer or be pushed to his absolute limits and see him struggle to attain victory. Thus he comes across as a bit too perfect as a character, and he doesn't grow or change as a result of his struggles. Number 4. Conclusion. I have not discussed the specific problems I have with some of the novels in the series, and I'm not going to. I only wanted to discuss the larger problems I had with the series to help illustrate to others some of the pitfalls and traps one can fall into while writing a lengthy book series. And of course, so I could listen to the sound of my own voice. Thanks for watching.